Hello, everyone. Welcome back to PSF for the Secular Soapbox, a show where we have strong opinions from a secular perspective, and we like to share. I am Brycearonee, and I'm here with co-host K-Lub. K-Lub, how you doing? I cannot hear K-Lub because he's muted right now. So let me adjust my settings. There we go. Computer, activate K-Lub.
Testing.
There we go. It worked.
I'm
K-Lub, I don't know if you've noticed.
Very well, despite that. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm here on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, NCC 1701D, because it's a very special occasion for me.
Do you think you'd be able to honestly tell the difference if I did a good? I don't know. Is there an F, for example? Like if I had just gone one off, would you be like, that's clearly E?
There actually is an F, but I don't know what it looks like because I haven't seen enough of Star Trek Discovery to know, and I don't think the majority of people would know. But this is probably the bridge of the Enterprise, one of the two bridges of the Enterprise that most people would be familiar with, because this was made famous by a show that was popular 30 years ago when I was a kid. So.
And in case it wasn't apparent, I'm just a casual fan. I do love Star Trek. I've grown up loving Star Trek. Never once thought, this is enough of this crap. Always been a huge fan. Just not like an adamant,
not like me,
passionate one. Yeah.
Not like me. Okay. Well, tonight, if you guys haven't figured out by now, tonight we are going boldly where no one has gone before. We are talking Star Trek. And this is kind of a recurring theme. Every now and then we like to do a light episode touching on pop culture and specifically science fiction and pop culture. We did a Star Wars episode, May the 4th be with you. We talked about Stargate and the influence that show has. Surprisingly, very underrated show with a lot of fans. And now we are getting into my personal favorite, Star Trek. And we have a couple of special guests with us tonight, presumably just as big of fans as Star Trek as I am. And they are going to help us dissect the way philosophy and religion intersect in the Star Trek universe. And we'll also probably talk a little bit about the influence that the series has had on society and vice versa. So our first guest is a former Baptist minister, a New Testament scholar. He's also a huge comic book fan, a fellow Superman fan, and he is the author of a variety of books discussing Christianity, myths, fiction, etc. Please welcome none other than Jesus mythicist, Dr. Robert Price.
That's me.
Dr. Price, thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor once again to talk to you.
Oh, it's a privilege and pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, our second guest, he is a professor of great courses, an ex-Christian turned atheist philosopher. He specializes in metaphysics and the relationship between pop culture and philosophy, particularly relevant in this episode. And he's also the author of a book called The Orville. Guess what that's about? We'll get into that a little bit later, too. Please welcome Dr. David Kyle Johnson.
Howdy, how's it going?
I said it right. I'm glad. I almost said Kyle Johnson, but David Kyle Johnson.
Yeah, I do the full David Kyle Johnson because there's so many Kyle Johnsons and David Johnsons out there.
There you go. But you know what? You have to have that middle name as a distinguishing feature, especially when you have a common name. Yeah. David, Kyle, and Johnson. Yeah. By themselves are common names.
I can't even do David K. Johnson because that's like a really famous journalist. He's the one that somebody sent Trump's tax returns to him or something, right? Like I have to do the full name, otherwise I get confused with other people. But the book, by the way, is Exploring the Orville.
Okay.
We can talk about that later.
Yes, we will, definitely. So thank you guys for joining us, first of all. It's interesting to me that when I was a kid in the 80s, I was called a nerd for being like a Star Trek. None of the other kids my age seemed to be into it the way that I was. And it seemed to me at the time that it was something that was not really taken seriously in the world. It was just kind of this, it was pop culture. It was a fad. It was what nerds were into, but it didn't seem to be taken as seriously in the real world. And now we have doctors and professors that are like huge fans of the show. So it kind of like validated me being a fan at that young age, and in my mind anyway.
And I mean, works published on it, right? Classes taught on it, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's gained a lot of legitimacy. Nerds have kind of taken over the world in a lot of ways, which in a really good way.
Right. And so now, Dr. Price, there's a burning question that I've had ever since I realized that we were going to be doing this episode, that you were going to be on, and I thought you might be able to help me answer this question. You ready?
Sure.
The question is, what does God need with a starship?
That brings up a real interesting question that permeates a lot of Star Trek, especially, for instance, Deep Space Nine with the wormhole aliens, and also all the original series episodes where the Enterprise crew is taken more or less for gods, or right. There's generation one too, where they this proto-Vulcan race, which I never understood what that's supposed to mean, but they think Picard is God and refer to him as the Picard. Right. And as I've often said in classes talking about the theories of origin of religion, I get to the space alien, Eric von Daniken theory, that was ancient astronauts, ancient alien space travelers, and that the primitive Earthlings, naturally seeing beings of such greater knowledge and power, regard them as gods. And I like to point out that though usually that, at least the way I've heard this, it seems like they're saying, well, of course, the early humans were just primitive buffoons and stupid, just beyond the level of animals. And so they mistook these aliens for gods. But I always think, well, suppose you could interview one of these people and say, and try to explain to them that Kirk and Spock and Picard were not gods. They were simply people from outer space who need to eat, they propagate, they are born and die. It's just that they have far superior, more comprehensive knowledge and much more deadly weapons and so forth. And that they don't actually fly, they have spacecraft, and you explain what that is. And my guess is that the primitive would say, well, yeah, that's what we mean by gods. Because in all the mythologies, they have vehicles like Apollo's chariot. All the Norse gods have different kinds of chariots, and in India, same thing.
Right. And weapons as well, Thor's hammer. And
and it's like, so what did they mean by gods? Really nothing different. So I think they really did understand. They didn't get the whole picture. But in the scenario, now, was this actually true? Well, I wasn't there. I don't know. But the point is, it's not quite what it's made into. It's not like they came up with some kind of that they would have come up with some sort of a delusion about it. No, it's just a question of how you describe it. And so whatever that's worth, that seems to me to even the one you're talking about, what does God need with a starship?
Yeah, that's Star Trek V.
Yeah, was he not a god? Look at the stuff he could do. A god. I mean, nobody's talking about Thomas Aquinas or Paul Tillich or Saint Anselm. Nobody in the Star Trek universe is talking about that than which no greater can be conceived, or being itself, right? That's a whole different shooting match. And what it kind of implies is, and I'll shut up in a minute, I also argue that there's no such thing as the supernatural, even if all the things in the Bible and other myths actually happened. Of course, I don't think they did for other reasons. But It's like in one of my favorites, the Voyage Home, where Chekhov is unconscious in the hospital, and Kirk and McCoy beam down and sneak into the hospital to save his life from the terrors of 20th century medicine. Right. I just love that. We're dealing with medievalism here, Jim, and so on. Well, yeah, but what does it turn out to be? Superior medicine that the 20th century doctors could not have any knowledge of.
Space magic. Hmm? That's what I like to call it.
He said space magic. Space magic.
Space magic.
Yeah, though ask yourself, as Thales did way back. Okay, he said, maybe it does rain because Zeus causes it, but how does he do it? There's got to be some means. Right. Even if you say, well, as the Quran says, he saith unto a thing, be, and it is. Well, how do you think that happens? Is it some vibration in the word, or he says, or what? Because there must be some way, or you're just talking cartoons.
Right.
And so it seems to me that if there are such transcendent beings who involve themselves in our affairs, the objectification of mythology, if there are such beings, they're just they have access to laws of the universe and forces that we don't yet understand or suspect. And I don't know that that's true, that there are. Maybe they're not. But the point is, I don't see how it could be something other than that. And then you're still talking about advanced aliens who have knowledge and techniques that we don't have. And so what is supernatural about it? What would that even mean?
Yeah, the inability for people who believe in the supernatural and that God did it, the inability of them to describe the mechanism by which God is doing anything is really problematic for credibility, because the whole point of positing God as an explanation is that it's an explanation, and yet you still can't explain how he did what he did. So you're not really explaining anything at that point,
God of the gaps, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it. Of course, the irony of that is that when you proclaim something as the work of God, because we can't figure it out otherwise, well, you're just trying to explain X with Z. It's no explanation at all.
Yeah,
and, but when you do find one, assuming, as we've continued to find that these things that once seemed miracles are really natural, then God's out of a job. He got his pink slip because of automation, basically. And so it's pretty obvious that's not the way to go. Even if there is a creator God, you can never invoke that. You always have to assume there will be some discoverable, understandable thing out there, or you're not getting anywhere in scientific inquiry.
Yeah,
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, one of my favorite philosophers is Ted Schick. He actually teaches at Muhlenberg University, that's just kind of down the road, about an hour from me. And I use his book, How to Think About Weird Things, in a number of my classes to teach critical thinking principles. And he has a paper that he published about a couple decades ago. It was when the journal Philo was still going. And the title of it is, Can God Explain Anything? And the answer, of course, to the question is no. And the way that he approaches this is the same way that he approaches the book. So in How to Think About Weird Things, he teaches this method of reasoning called abduction, or inference to the best explanation, where you have 5 principles: testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, conservatism. And you use those to find the best explanation among different alternatives, right? And that's like, by definition, that's what good explanation should do. And these criteria are used in science. They're used basically anywhere you're looking for an explanation. And the argument is that invoking God as an explanation will always fail, because it will always fail, like by its very nature, as an explanation to match up to these criteria, right? The example he gives in the book is, if a bridge collapsed and you were tasked with explaining why the bridge collapsed, you could build it back better, right? So it wouldn't collapse again. And somebody came along and said, well, I know it made the bridge collapse. An incomprehensible being zapped it with an incomprehensible force. right? Maybe an alien with a ray gun that's with technology beyond what we can understand. And you said, okay, where'd the alien come from? I don't know. They're incomprehensible. How does the ray gun work? I don't know. It's incomprehensible. It's beyond our understanding. That doesn't help. That's not, I mean, you can call it an explanation, but it is by no means a good explanation at all. Notice it will not help you build a better bridge next time that won't collapse for the same reason, right? And then the argument is that anytime you invoke God did it as an explanation, that's essentially all you're doing. An incomprehensible being did it with an incomprehensible force. That's not an explanation. As Plato put it over 2,500 years ago, that's you making an excuse for not having an explanation. That's you refusing to acknowledge that you can't explain it. And so you're just, Deus ex machina, you're just throwing in God there, as Dr. Price mentioned, the God of the gaps kind of fallacy, right? But by their very nature, divine explanations can't be good explanations because they invoke the inexplicable.
Dr. Johnson, a few moments ago, Dr. Price brought up an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. The name of the episode is Who Watches the Watchers?
And the name of the aliens is the Mentakins.
The Mentakins, right. The episode where they go to the planet where it's their primitive culture, Stone Age. I think they're a little bit past the Stone Age, but basically...
they use bows and arrows.
Right.
They use bows and arrows. They have a sundial to tell the time and keep dates and that kind of stuff, right?
So then...
I know this episode very well because I've taught it in class, but go ahead.
Oh, awesome. So the moment that Dr. Price referenced essentially happens in that episode. Toward the end of the episode, Picard beams the leader aboard the Enterprise and tells her, I'm not a god. This is not magic. This is just technology, just like your bow is technology to people who would have existed before you, and tries to show her the mechanism by which he is able to do things, bring people who seem to be dead back to life, but they weren't really dead, but, advanced medicine and all of this stuff. The Bible. Does the Bible explain anything to anyone?
Does the Bible explain anything to anyone?
Yes.
It doesn't offer good explanations. It does offer some explanations, I suppose, for some things, right?
Let me elaborate, because what I'm looking for is, does the Bible explain the mechanism or methodology by which anything non-naturalistic happens?
Yeah, I mean... Not very well. The only kind of explanation I can think of, like Genesis 1 and 2 is supposed to be an explanation for where the universe came from, right? Or where the world came from. So it kind of offers that explanation. It's not a very good explanation, but it does it. It also offers explanation like, why do women suffer pain during childbirth? Well, it's because of what Eve did, and God's punishing them, right, for what Eve did. And this is why we have to work and toil, right? So it offers certain kinds of explanations, right?
It seems to be a bunch of whys, but no how.
No mechanism there. Yeah, there's no mechanism there, right? There's not like a scientific explanation really that I can think of that's offered. There's you're being punished, and that's why that happened kinds of explanations. But I can't think of any kind of like scientific, mechanistic. This happened. This is why it rains because there's moisture in the sky or whatever.
God separated the waters from the lands. Okay, how did he do that?
Yeah, right.
In what way?
Yeah, and it's just inexplicable force, right? That's an inexplicable power that by which he was able to do that. Yeah.
Well, this is very similar to the more or less contemporary Ionian philosophers. Pre-Socratic, they're trying to explain what happened, but they would always run up against the wall, like what caused the centrifuge of elements. The same thing comes up in ancient Indian cosmogony. They didn't know, but they tried to figure it out on the basis of what they did know or think they knew. And as Wellhausen pointed out way back there in the late 19th century, that's what Genesis 1, the priestly creation account, is. It's not mythology. It's just ancient natural philosophy, as they call it. And they did what they could in the limits they had. And they're actually demythologizing an earlier version where God creates the world from the carcasses of dragons that he killed, which is common with the Mesopotamians and various others. But here it's like instead of Tiamat, this dragon, you have Tahom or Tohu, both occur there. And what Tahom is the ocean depth, and Tohu means formless. And so they've been made into abstractions in the Genesis 1 account. Mm-hmm. And were there great sea beasts? Well, they still figured there were, but now they appear on one of the days of creation just as animals, much like we think of whales today. Yeah. So there's an attempt there toward rational explanation. But I think that the best two types of stories that are feeling toward some kind of rational explanation, though they couldn't quite have gotten there. One would be the Exodus, when it says that the locusts attacked Egypt and devoured everything because a stiff west wind, I think it is, blew them off their usual trajectory. And that's pretty much the way it puts it. I don't have the exact words.
Have you seen the film Exodus? Gods and Kings. It's a Ridley Scott film that was released a few years ago, but it's basically the story of the Exodus. I think it's got Christian Bale playing.
Oh yeah, I did see most of it, and then I had to leave to pick up my daughter from somewhere.
I
didn't care much for it.
I didn't either, but I suspect the reasons we didn't like it may have been different, because when I was a Christian when I saw the movie, and I still believed in the Bible, and I recognized just from the way that the story was being told, this is an atheist's interpretation of the Exodus. You know, Ridley Scott is an atheist and he's telling a Bible story, but every time something supernatural seems to be happening, there's always a scientific explanation for it that doesn't exist in the Bible, but it's posited as this is really just a naturalistic thing. For all we know, God is just in Moses's head the whole time, you know? Because no one else can see God except Moses, and when he's talking to him, he appears to be talking to himself. The parting of the Red Sea and all of that seems to be, it's not actually parting. It's, you know, that the tide is Moses knew the tides, and so it's all. And then there was that part with the locusts as well, where there's an attempt at a scientific explanation. So when you brought that up, it just reminded me of that movie. I deconverted shortly after that film, and so now my interpretation of it would probably be different if I saw it. I do want to bring in K-Lub for a quick question, though, because as a casual Star Trek fan, you still have valid opinions, and I'm curious as to what your opinion on this question will be. Speaking of gods, which character do you think comes closest to a god, a classical god in Star Trek? Can you think of anyone who would fit that description?
Well, I mean, obviously there's the Q.
Okay, that is the correct answer.
Oh, okay.
So no more maybes. Yeah, Q. That's who I was thinking about. But what do you guys think of how he was presented? Because Q appears to be godlike to most of the other races that he interacts with Picard and crew. When he appears on this ship, you know, they think that he's a phony, and they recognize that he has powers, but they don't see him as a god. So how was that handled on the Next Generation? Should Q be considered to be a god or not?
In the, like, as Dr. Price was talking about, like in the kind of lowercase g type of the word, right? In the same way that 3,000 years ago, humans would consider Captain Kirk a god, right? Because he has these technologies and yada, 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 right? Because he's pretty similar to Zeus, right? He can do the kinds of things that they thought Zeus would do or whatever. And so you could consider Q a god in that way. In fact, even more so perhaps because he seems to be immortal, right? Like in the episode with the Mintakans, what convinces her, and I'm trying to remember the character's name, but what convinces the leader of the Mintakans to not believe that Picard is a god anymore, that she's not convinced by the explanations like this is just advanced technology. What she's convinced by is when one of them dies,
Right.
And she's like, "Oh, you're mortal like us, so I guess you're not a god, right?"
Right. And then the other guy's convinced when he sees Picard himself injured and he sees his blood.
Right.
Behold a god who bleeds.
Yes, there you go. Right. So so given that Q is actually immortal, right? Like there might be a little bit more room for calling him, a god, even than like, than other candidates, right? But I mean, he's certainly not the god of Anselm and Aquinas, right? Like, the perfect being, the triomni God, all perfect, all knowing, that kind of stuff, right? Because he's not morally perfect, right? He's all knowing apparently, right? But he's not morally perfect, so we wouldn't classify as that kind of God. But I mean, it's, when it comes to these kind of things as a philosopher, I'm usually of the ilk to just say it just depends on your definition of God. By one definition, he would be, on another definition, he wouldn't be. And there's no right or wrong definition. That's just, the way we talk.
I think he's Loki. He's as immortal as the other Q, but he's uniquely mischievous and malicious. And that can be a god, according to Loki as a good example, possibly even Hermes. But that's still, you're dealing, as you say, with small g god. And I think of this episode where Picard dies on the operating table and he meets Q in a white robe, and he intimates that he's God, and Picard says, "You are not God." That
universe is not so badly designed.
Yeah, the universe is too badly designed for Q to be God, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted, but yeah.
Is there any example of small g God that we couldn't say is an alien?
In Star Trek or in real world?
Period. Like as a category.
No.
So why even bother with this little g thing? Like, can we just call them aliens?
No,
because I think that the gods thing has way too much baggage.
Well, but so that goes back to Dr. Price's question. What does it mean to be a god?
Well, I think that if you're an alien, you're not.
What does God mean?
God? Well, I think my definition may in fact be impossible, but God would be the person from which all real things come from. So the creator of everything.
But, yeah, see, I think that's uppercase G God, right? Like that's the name of the being. God is the name that Christians have assigned to the perfect being of Aquinas and Anselm and that kind of stuff. And that's what you're talking about. Uppercase,
more or less.
Right?
I wouldn't go as far as to say perfect, just a person. That's the thing that I quarrel, because I mean, I don't think that such a thing is possible, but that's the only thing that I would consider actually to be a god. It's just the person that creates all. I'm going to let
Dr. Johnson follow up on this, but I have a theory about that, Caleb. And my theory is that because you've been raised in a Judeo-Christian society where they have taken the label God and used it as a title, as a name, proper name for their God, that's why you have a conception that that's what God ought to be. But in most societies that predate the Judeo-Christian or monotheistic presentation of God, they were polytheistic, and a God meant something else. It was just a title for a supreme being that seemed to be more powerful than humans. Take it away, experts.
Yeah, no, I think that's essentially right. Although they may not use the word God, right? Lowercase g God, because that's an English word and they're not speaking English, right?
Right.
But that's the word we use in English to refer to these kind of non-Aquinian, non-perfect beings, right? Like Zeus and Apollo or Ra or Mithras or whatever, right? They're not the creator of everything, but they're more powerful. So to Caleb's point, right? There is no lowercase God that couldn't be explained as an alien. Like you could say, oh, that if you actually thought they were real, right? If you actually thought Zeus was actually a real being back then, you could say, well, it's actually more likely that he was an alien rather than a lowercase g God.
I'll take it a step further. Even if we assume that this thing was spawned from the divine into another universe, the chaos, and did his thing and was a real person, like an actual existent thing. Even that's not a god to me. That's just an alien that was spawned by virtue of that's what nature allowed to. That was the type of creature that nature allowed to exist.
So it would still be natural. You're divorcing that. You're basically saying there's no such thing as a supernatural, which is where I think everyone else landed as well, right?
Though in Star Trek, in Who Mourns for Apollo, they make it real clear that the ancient Greek gods, who were called gods, theoi, our word God is simply a translation of that, and it was used for, or in Hebrew, Elohim is a plural word, and so various beings were El this, El that, if we're talking about the rules of play in Star Trek, they do say that the Greek gods were alien life forms who were enormously powerful but needed a power source, right? They eventually find the thing and disable it.
I was just about to bring up Who Mourns for, I think it's Who Mourns for Adonis, but Apollo.
I was going to say Adonias or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah, but Apollo is clearly the protagonist or the antagonist of that episode, and he's portrayed as this kind of emotional guy that really needs to be loved / worshipped in the episode, and just the fact that the Enterprise crew doesn't worship him. He's angered and he's hurt, and he realizes by the end of the episode, these people don't love me. I have no purpose. And then he ascends to a different realm. But you're right. They clearly state that they're aliens. I don't think they use the word, but the implication that they came from the stars searching for other places, and then they found humans who were willing to worship them, and they were willing to be their protectors or whatever kind of excuses they need. And then Captain Kirk is like, we've outgrown you. We have no use for gods anymore. Unfortunately, he also delivers the line, we have no use for gods. We find the one sufficient.
Yeah.
And I think that was thrown in there to make it digestible for the 1960s audience. I don't think you were allowed to be an atheist on TV.
And my understanding is that Roddenberry did not like that, in the same way that he did not like the Bread and Circuses episode at the end, where they kind of seem to imply that Jesus is real, right? Like, I don't remember the exact line or whatever, but Uhura is like, they tried to debunk it, but they couldn't, because didn't you get it? It's the Son of God or whatever, right? Like, and that I listened to the Star Trek Minute podcast. I'm sorry, not Star Trek Minute. That's Star Wars Minute. Star Trek Mission Log, the Star Trek Mission Log podcast, and they're going through every episode of Star Trek, episode by episode, and have a full cast. And they, long time ago, they already went through all the way through the original episodes, and they go a little bit behind the scenes and talk about that kind of stuff. And if memory serves, I know that Roddenberry didn't like the Bread and Circuses, that line in Bread and Circuses. I know that.
It's the very last line of the episode, if I remember correctly.
I think they slipped it in without him even knowing. Like, he found out after it aired, or after it was already kind of said and done. And he was not happy about
because it was not necessary, because this episode, they beam back to the ship. It's like it's like Act 5 before the credits, before the end credits, and Spock is talking about how it's illogical that this culture would have evolved from sun worship or whatever. Sun worship is an ancient primitive superstition, and then that's when Uhura. They could have ended it there.
They should have
and left it up to the imagination, and then Uhura delivers that line. No, it's the Son of God.
Well, it's the sun and the sky thing that always bothered me about it. Rome had no sun worship, but what do you think? Helios and Apollo and Mithras were. I mean, Mithras is the sun god who became the chief god of the Roman Empire eventually. So somebody didn't do their homework there.
Yeah. Writers.
Why? I mean, it was a way they introduced that to set up the thing with Uhura saying they're talking about the Son of God.
Yeah, right. You're right.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that Roddenberry objected to the one is
sufficient. No, I'm sure you're right.
I'm pretty sure that's. Go back and listen to that episode of Star Trek Mission Log, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
But it could have been that whole sequence, as Dr. Price said, because why else would Spock have said that other than to set up Uhura to say that line? You know.
So here's a little bit of trivia that you might find. Why do I have this pencil in my hand? A little bit of trivia that you might find interesting, and I learned this from the Mission Log podcast too. Are you guys aware of what the first draft of the first Star Trek movie was? Like the original kind of idea that Roddenberry had.
I mean, God.
Yeah, so it was Voyager kind of idea there, but the story actually starts with V'ger already kind of there, and like the whole world believes that V'ger is God. And there's like this whole cult of Voyager worship going on. And Kirk and Spock and the Enterprise are the only ones that kind of see through it and see what it is. And they have to kind of debunk it and get rid of it. And it was a very secular humanist religion is a dangerous, dumb idea kind of. And of course it didn't make it through, right? Because, we can't make a movie that says that for Americans. But it's a fascinating game. Look at the Mission Log podcast and go back, and whenever they talk about Star Trek 1, around those episodes, they did some kind of behind the scenes stuff and talked about that. It's fascinating to kind of realize what that movie could have been.
What do you think they were trying to do with Star Trek 5? Because this is the movie where the premise of the movie is they go to meet God.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, there's some overlap there. There was a little bit of trying to pull some of that old Star Trek 1 idea that didn't make it through, and they're trying to do some of that there. It's just that, William Shatner didn't pull it off all that well. But I think that there's something similar there, right? But notice that it doesn't, we just failed to find the right God, right? It doesn't debunk the idea of God the way that, and is critical of it in the way, the episode that I described of Star Trek 1 would have been directly kind of insinuated that religion is dangerous and kind of ignorant, right? In this one, we just realized that what we thought was God actually just turned out to be a con artist. And so,
I actually think,
right. And
I think Star Trek 5 is it's anti-Christian and it's anti-certain God models, but it's pro-religion to some extent. It's pro-theism.
Yeah.
It's definitely, because I think Bones says at the end of the movie, maybe God's not out there, maybe he's right in here with us or something like that. And I'm like, now I love this. Again, I was a Christian for all of most of my life and seeing all this stuff. So I actually, appreciated those little nods and winks. But looking back on it now, did Gene Roddenberry approve this? Did this go across his desk? Did he have any hand in this? Knowing what I know about him now.
Yeah,
I don't think he did.
I think he was. I don't know if he was passed away by that point, but I think he was kind of out of the process by the time that Star Trek 5 came along. Super removed. A little bit of trivia here. There's a Christian, thinking of episode 5 or Star Trek 5 being Christian. There's a Christian band called Mortal, Mortal, and their second album is filled with sound bites from Star Trek 5. And it's mixed in all the different, they're like an industrial band that's doing all kinds of weird stuff, but they really like that movie too, apparently thinking it was pretty pro-theism or whatever. And
it is. It's a pro-theism movie, but much to the chagrin of Gene Roddenberry, I'm sure, the very first episode of Star Trek, not the first pilot, I guess the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, I think this really introduced a recurring trope in not only Star Trek, but in science fiction, the idea of someone becoming a god or godly or godlike and what that would mean. Do you guys remember that episode?
Oh yeah.
It's Gary Mitchell, I think was the name of the character, and something, they go to the edge of the universe or the edge of the galaxy or whatever, and the ship gets struck by something and he's affected, and then all of a sudden he has ESP and
Gary Mitchell.
Wow, your shirt. Let me see your shirt. You've got all kinds of, is that entirely Star Trek?
Well, here's the thing. There's my little nerd test for my shirt.
Looks like the Millennium Falcon there.
Yes, this is my conversation starter at parties. It is all Star Trek, except for some reason there's a Millennium Falcon right there. So I bought it online. I came from China. I'm pretty sure it's not licensed, and so somebody who didn't know enough about Star Trek put it together. They got most of it right, and then there's the Millennium Falcon. So, but yeah, it's a fun shirt. You got over here. You've got the City on the Edge of Forever, right? So classic, and then even new Trek here, and all kinds of fun stuff on it. But you're right. And to speak, kind of to go back to Caleb's point about do you consider Gary Mitchell a god, right? As a philosopher, something that I have learned is that debates about how we should use words usually don't get us very far, become very frustrating, because we just end up there is no kind of objective way to determine how specific words can be used, because words can be used in many ways, right? There's this classic example from Charles Sanders Peirce who asks if you're going around a tree and there's a squirrel on the tree and the squirrel's going around the tree at the same rate as you, so the squirrel's back is always to you, do you go around the squirrel as you go around the tree? Right? And you think about it, like, well, its back is always to me. But the answer is, there is no answer. It just depends on what you mean by around. If you mean northwest, south, and then east, yes. If you mean to the front, the left, the back, and then the right, then no. And that's all there is to say about the matter. There's just two different definitions of the word around. You just clear about what you mean by which one you have in mind, and then there's nothing else to say. So do we consider Gary Mitchell a god? It depends on how you define the word. There's no one right way to define it. We just make clear what our definitions are, and then we can move on. Otherwise, we just get stuck in a circle debating about something that can't be settled.
I'm laughing a little bit only because I do literally that every day. I have a dog, and we run to the park, and she chases squirrels, and they run up trees, and then we end up going around the trees. Literally did it today. So there you go. Go ahead, K-Lub. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. That's perfectly fine. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I want to talk about Star Trek.
Dr. Price. So we've talked about the whole God and a religious angle. I'm curious, before we get into, because I do want to talk a little bit touch on science and the other the social commentary aspect, really. But I would like your opinion. Is Star Trek actually science fiction, or is it fantasy space opera?
I guess it's more like space opera and sword and planet fiction, as is sometimes called, more in the Edgar Rice Burroughs tradition than the Arthur C. Clarke tradition. And that's, I guess the marker is that Star Trek is like, and Star Wars, are heroic epics. Whereas stuff like 2001 and many other ones, there's no real hero necessarily. It's like a cautionary tale about the future. Suppose this is possible, what would we do? Should we do it? Should we make it possible or not? And things like the Andromeda Strain and so forth, where it's a situation that comes, or I, Robot, or a bunch of these things, or Foundation, and so on and so on. That's more inherently social, I think. Social issues come up in Star Trek, partly because the hero has to be a person of character, and so values will appear now and again, but they don't really have to. And it's really action mainly, and so there's little attempt to explain the amazing things that are happening. Whereas it seems like some of the stuff in science fiction proper is more about explanation, like extrapolation from what we do know already. Right. Off the top of my head, it seems to me that's a difference.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, especially with the media that you mentioned, 2001 and iRobot and all of that, seem to be much more realistic takes with the trajectory that we are going. I mean, they got 2001 wrong. They got the year wrong. We're not exploring Jupiter yet, but all the ideas were rooted in something that was grounded, something that was realistic for the time, and frankly realistic now in a lot of ways, at least scientifically. The science of what they were saying was pretty accurate. It's just a matter of finding a monolith, but certainly with AI and building ship, we could build a ship to go explore Jupiter. I don't know who would pay for it or what the time frame would be, but these things seemed plausible enough, and they seem to be rooted in and reality as they understood it at the time and as we understand it now. Whereas when I look at something like Star Trek, it is science fiction. It's about space and the future, and they have phasers and all this other stuff, but they don't explain the technology or even the concepts behind. I mean, there's an attempt at an explanation, but they only go so far. How do the transporters work? they have Heisenberg compensators. Cool. How does a Heisenberg compensator work? We don't
just
know.
Does.
It just does. Yeah. The whole point of the Heisenberg compensators was because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which should make transporters impossible, but they have Heisenberg compensators, right? So it's science fiction in that way, that they at least attempt to kind of explain the science, but it's like bogus science or not. It's magic. It's space magic.
Another thing that marks Star Trek as more fantasy is the things you have to swallow that are totally implausible, like each planet having a whole planetary government, even if they're primitive. That's just to simplify the narrative, but there's no way that could happen. And the universal translator, that's just a MacGuffin, is that what they call it?
It can be.
It's not absolutely out of the question that, I mean, on
we have Google Translate and stuff like that.
It's not inconceivable, but the minute you meet these aliens, you can chat in colloquial English and sometimes
in real time.
Yeah. How is it that Kirk could possibly translate "e plebnista"? I mean, that depends on it being degraded English,
right.
But it's just there for making the narrative work.
Yeah, which, I mean, it worked for its time, and I think it still works because, in my opinion, Star Trek is about social commentary. It's not really about science. It's not really about alien, like all of that stuff is really just kind of a smokescreen for Gene Roddenberry at the time to kind of tell stories that he wanted to tell about the human condition and society and American society in the 60s. Like that's really what Star Trek was. It was 1960s. You're not allowed to talk about racism and atheism and all of these things, but how do we talk about it anyway? We'll call it something else. We'll make it aliens, and then we'll put it in the show to show how stupid they are, or how dumb this idea is.
Yeah, and historically speaking, you're right. I think that's what Gene Roddenberry was doing, is using it as an excuse to talk about these kind of things when he couldn't get away with it in regular shows. But saying that it's only about that maybe undercuts the amount of influence that Star Trek has had on inspiring people to be scientists and astronauts and that kind of stuff, right? If I could kind of jump in here on the issue of whether it's science fiction, right? It sounds like Dr. Price is kind of using a definition of, if it's not hard sci-fi, then it's not science fiction.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's correct. Yeah.
And this is a definitional issue. Define your terms how you want, right? Like, so I can accept that definition, and certainly by that definition, Star Trek doesn't qualify. By more liberal definitions, right? If we define it as cautionary tale about the future that doesn't kind of like defy physics, that like everything's in it is scientifically believable, The Handmaid's Tale would be hard sci-fi, because it's a cautionary tale about the future with that, right? Which I am perfectly fine with that, because let me say the definition that I use. So I did, for great courses, I did sci-fi, science fiction as philosophy. And the definition that I used in here is Damon Knight's definition, which is, let me quote it here directly: science fiction is what we point to when we say it. Right. It's kind of like the porn definition. You know it when you see it. Right. And so it's a very liberal definition. And so I included The Handmaid's Tale in my sci-fi course, even though a lot of people would argue it's not sci-fi. I don't care. I think it's interesting. It's got important things to say. We're going to talk about it. Right. Definitely.
Yeah. It's a very subjective terminology. And I remember James Cameron, an interview I was listening to with him, where he was discussing when he was first making the Terminator and trying to get that approved. And he was describing it, and he gave the script to people and said, I'm doing this science fiction movie. It's going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. And they read the script, and they're like, this isn't science fiction. This is about a serial killer running around LA trying to kill a woman. Right. And he was like, no, that's not. It's about a future. It's preventing a future war, and there's time travel, and there's robots, but it's really, if you watch the original Terminator, it's a small aspect of the movie. The movie really is about a guy running around LA trying to kill a woman, and everything else is like kind of in the background. And then eventually at the end of the movie, they reveal okay, it's science fiction, it's a robot and all of that. But
right, yeah, Terminator 2 doesn't have that problem because
it doesn't. But that's just I brought that up just to speak to the subjectivity of science fiction and what counts and what should count and what, and so it's all science fiction because fantastic ideas. I think the line between science fiction and fantasy has been blurred. I think when people hear fantasy, they think older magic, wizards and warriors and dragons and stuff. And when they hear science fiction, they think space and the future and all that. And I don't want to divert it to Star Wars, but Star Wars is more fantasy than science fiction.
You can definitely make that argument. It is because Jedis are space wizards, right? So do you call that science fiction or fantasy?
There's sword fighting. There's space wizards.
I think that's the greatest example to bring up. Why the real distinction here is it magic, or is there some real naturalistic explanation for it? Until midichlorians, it was fantasy. Now it's science fiction.
So that's the answer. The answer in 1977, it was fantasy because the Force is an energy field that surrounds us and binds the universe together and gives a Jedi his power. And then in 1999, the Force was midichlorian. So take your choice.
Let me push
it's
back.
It's a good line in the sand to have, though.
Go ahead. We got some pushback.
Yeah, just a smidge. One
before we get back to Star Trek,
because the midichlorians don't make the Force work. The midichlorians are just how the Jedi know about the Force and that kind of. So you could still hold on to some mystical something there. Secondly, this is my headcanon. That midichlorian stuff is just bullshit. But that Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon made up to like mess with Anakin or what? Like it's stuff that Jedi pull on Padawans as a joke, and then it's not real. I think that
Dr. Johnson, you are a rare breed that is both a Star Trek fan and a Star Wars fan. You seem to be avid fans of both.
Absolutely.
And is that even a correct assertion that you are a rare breed? Like how common are you?
Yeah, I don't know. I know a lot of people who like both, but I know a lot of people who are avid one, not the other. But I know both of them inside and out. I got action figures for both. There's my Star Trek. There's my Star Wars. There's my Star Trek over there.
Bravo.
I know it. I know it all, and I don't see any reason that you can't like both.
How about you, Dr. Price?
I feel the same way, and I've got 2 Darth Vader figures here. And as to Star Trek, I've got Kirk, Data, Tuvok, Gul Dukat, and Gowron figures around here with loads more upstairs.
Nice.
But I have to admit, I became really disappointed. I loved the first one. I must have seen it I saw it the first day it came out, and even have my May the Force be with you button that they gave out that day. And I loved that. I saw it like 20 plus times in the theater. But then the second one came out, and I liked a few moments in it, but I immediately noticed it sounded like the dialogue was written by doting fans, and then
are you talking about Empire Strikes Back?
He is talking about Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah. Okay. And then when the Ewoks appeared, Yoda, in other words, the green Fozzie bear, I thought, what is going on here? And then in the third one, where the teddy bears defeated the crack stormtroopers of the Empire. What the hell? And it just kept getting worse from there. And so I haven't even seen the last couple of them. I just don't care. I wish they'd have stopped after the first one, which I still love. Whereas Star Trek, there's very little that makes me sick to my stomach there in the whole thing. Though I've never seen Star Trek Discovery. Especially, I did get the streaming service to watch Picard, which I like very much. But Discovery, early on, one of the main actors said, "If you're a Trump voter, we don't want you to see this. It's not for you." And I said, "Okay, I'll take you at your word. You can stuff it where the Nova don't explode." And so I've never seen that and never planned to.
It is. I've only seen a few episodes of Discovery, and they were okay, but it didn't really. I think maybe the style of storytelling combined with the characters just didn't really hold my attention, and I never really got into it. How do you feel about Discovery, Dr. Johnson?
I have seen all of it. I watched it all the way through. I am not a huge fan. I'm a fan enough to I enjoy it when I watch it, finished it through. It did some interesting things as it went forward. Captain Pike was involved at one point. I enjoyed the
I am looking forward to the new one with Captain Pike.
Me too. But again, in the same way that like you can like both Star Wars and Star Trek, you can like classic Trek and then also like Discovery. Now, I do not like Discovery nearly as much as I like Next Generation or Enterprise or even Voyager, but it's still Trek, and I like it. Same way with the Orville, that a lot of people are like, well, you can't like, if you like Star Trek, you can't like the Orville because they're too similar. No, absolutely
Who says
not.
that?
I can love both, right? And I really enjoy the Orville, and I think the Orville does classic style TNG and old style Trek better than Discovery does. I still watch Discovery.
And I was going to see, because I'm a fan. I watched the whole first season of the Orville. I haven't seen the second season yet.
It's even better than the first. It's great.
Yeah,
stuff.
I loved them both.
Hey, K-Lub, have you seen the Orville?
I have. I don't know if I've seen them all, but I've seen a good chunk of it. Yeah.
In my opinion, the Orville is more Star Trek than Star Trek Discovery. I don't know if you just said that. Maybe I might be parroting.
I think I did, and that's hi, buddy. I think that's right. And I think it does Star Trek better than what Star Trek is doing now. I like Picard too, but I think the Orville's better than Picard. I think the Orville's better than Discovery. We'll see if it's better than the new Pike show that's coming out. I think it's
very next.
The new
it's very next generation.
It's very next generation. And the first chapter of my book. So this is an edited volume. This is an edited volume. I wrote through the introduction and 2 other chapters in it. I have a chapter on time travel. I have a chapter on climate change, and then the introduction. But the first regular chapter, it's actually laid out like an episode of Star Trek or the Orville, where the introduction comes second. There's like a teaser that comes in first, and then there's and then the introduction, and then there's an act. Like literally, it's divided into acts. Right, just like an episode is, right? And the teaser by Brooke Rudow is the Orville Star Trek. That is the title of the chapter. And what she argues is that, again, it's kind of a definitional issue, right? But what she argues essentially is the kind of best way to understand what the Orville is that it's really well written fan fiction. That essentially has to deal with copyright, so it can't call itself Star Trek. But I mean, it's 25th century. So you could, if you wanted to, imagine that in 100 years after TNG, the Federation became the Union, right? And the design of the ships changed, and it's just in the same universe, right? If you wanted to, right? But that's
they don't have transporters though.
They don't have transporters, so maybe those we could ad hoc, we could retcon some explanation.
What is the reason for that? Do we know?
I don't remember Seth saying anything in particular about why there aren't transporters, except for maybe it makes it less hard sci-fi, right? You kind of have to suspend disbelief for that to work. Although there are transporters in the show, just not on the Orville. Like in the second or third episode, the captain and first officer gets transported by kind of more advanced technology than they have, right, to a distant location.
I think it's also like that, they're trying to make fun of like what it would actually be like, but it's sort of like in a goofy way. And if you had teleporters and you're trying to be clever about having teleporters, you could really be quite godlike with that technology alone. Like there's so much on-tap potential that you don't see in Star Trek itself. They usually just get you in and out, depending on the situation, sooner than later. But I mean, that's basically the gist of it. It's sort of like get you out of jail, but that's kind of like the extent of it. But really, if you were clever with teleporter technology, sky's the limit. You could be a monster or nearly godlike, probably.
Yeah, almost any problem can be solved with the transporter, right? Like you just, you're sick. Well, we'll just put you back through the transporter and heal your wound, right? Like it really does. Like it was a really good solution for Roddenberry because they couldn't afford the special effects to land the ship on a planet every week, right?
Yeah, I was about to ask K-Lub if he knew how the transporters came about,
but Seth doesn't have that problem. They don't have any budget problems, right? So you kind of need for it. And half the time on Star Trek, you have to like you have to figure out an excuse for why you can't just use the transporter to get out of it. That's why they go down all the time. Right. Or there's interference and we can't beam them out or whatever. You're constantly having to come up with these ad hoc explanations for why we just can't use the transporter.
Everybody, the transporter seems to serve as both Deus Ex Machina. It can be used as a solution to damn near any problem, but it can also serve as the MacGuffin that Dr. Price was talking about. It can cause the problems too.
Yeah, which is fun. I mean, I'm glad Star Trek had transporters. There's great episodes. And when in philosophy class, when we talk about personal identity, the go-to, question is if Spock's on the ship here, you deassemble him, you reassemble him here. Is it the same person? It's the perfect, it's the.
What about when Riker got split, right?
Or you can talk about Riker splitting, right? The same. It's a beautiful thought experiment to talk about issues in philosophy in metaphysics about personal identity.
Go ahead, Dr. Price.
The Voyager episode that reversed the original series where Kirk was split into the good Kirk and the bad Kirk. They reversed it so that Tuvok and
Neelix
got fused. And when they finally figured out how to disentangle them, that brought up a huge moral issue.
That's a horrible episode.
It was brilliant.
It's a great episode, but it's a horrible ending. Because because the solution. So yes and no. Obviously, it needed to end the way that it did so that the show could continue because you need Tuvok and Neelix. You didn't need Neelix, but you need Tuvok, right? But did they make the correct moral decision by splitting?
Was there one?
I mean, I think it was murder. I think
it was, but I think it was necessary murder.
It was a murder of one to save two. So if you're a utilitarian, you could argue that it is justified.
Oh, just on those.
That's a good point.
If you're a Kantian, you would say nope, you never murder regardless of the consequence, right? So you would say it's wrong. Utilitarian would say it's right because you're exchanging one life for two. So
see, I'm probably gonna throw myself under a bus here, but I kind of go with like a Tom Jump thing with consent being front and foremost for me. And neither of those two consented to being one being. And so that one being, by just merely existing, is violating two other beings.
Yeah, and do we know, I don't think they intimated, did they, whether Tuvok and Neelix afterward had memories of when they were united?
Because I don't recall. I'll have to go back and watch it.
That's not just total annihilation of Tuvix.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good. I'm gonna have to go back and watch this episode now.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember. I just actually I just watched all of Voyager from front to back. It took me about 6 months or whatever, and that episode's pretty early on in the series, so it's been a while, and I don't remember.
How much time do you guys have? We're at the hour mark, and our shows run between an hour, or they can go longer. So
keep going. I'm good.
We can go a little bit longer.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we go on,
I am going to deuce out though. I do have to. It's my day to deal with the son.
And
so
Caleb has
I
to
gotta go
for parental duties.
Just because I can stick around for a little bit, but I don't know if you're talking like another half hour to an hour or so. But just on the off chance, I don't want to break it up. I think you found a good spot. It's at the hour.
Well, I don't go longer than 1:30, so
okay.
Go deal with your son, and if you can be back in 15 minutes, we'll wrap it up with Caleb.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. Hey, by the way, thank you, Dr. Price and Dr. Johnson. It was wonderful talking with you guys. Well, listening, really. I didn't honestly do very much talking tonight, which is my fault. Didn't really contribute as much as I would like, but you guys are fascinating. And thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, good luck dealing with the son of God. I assume that's who you're talking about.
Oh, man. My son of late. We had a couple episodes back where we were talking about parenting and things like that. And I said how he kind of goes at ebbs and weaves through these cycles of belief and disbelief in God. Well, he's been on a real hard I believe in God streak for a while, and he's actually pushing my buttons like, Dad, dude, you should probably believe in God. I'm like, you know what? I don't want to have this conversation with a 6-year-old. Like, you do you, man. I try to bring up well, why do you believe this, that, or the other whenever he wants to talk about it? Like, I don't just let him get away with it scot-free. But, he's not always asking questions like, how does God do this or that or the other? He's just telling me that God does this, that, and the other. Like,
how old is your son, Caleb?
He's 6.
Have you started him on Star Trek yet?
Not yet. Not yet. I
Might be something to consider.
Now is the time. Actually, he's been really interested in a lot of the sciencey stuff. He actually got 3 different science lab experiment thing kits that have like, I don't know, young scientist gizmos and gadgets and stuff in it. We've been having a lot of fun playing with them, but man, you got 3 of those things, and they each of them has like 64 experiments in it. So it's been taking a while to go through it, but he absolutely loves every second of it.
Wow. All right, go take care of your kid.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
we're gonna wrap up with Star Trek, and maybe we'll get you back, and maybe not. So speaking of parenting. This is a little off topic, but I guess it's a natural transition point. This is mostly opinionated. Who's the best parent on Star Trek, in your opinion? You can pick any Star Trek show, any Star Trek movie. When you think of a good parent on the show, because there's been quite a few of them.
Name some. I'm only coming up with Beverly Crusher right off the top of my head.
Beverly has a kid. Worf has a kid. Depending on how far you gotten into Picard, Troy and Riker have a kid/kids.
Right. Cisco
has a kid. O'Brien has kids.
Right. The DS9, the Ferengi, not Quark's brother. Nog, right?
Yeah.
Or Rom, and Nog's his kid, right?
Yeah. Nog is the kid. Yeah. Yeah, I think those are the relevant ones.
There's one kid on Voyager, but we don't see her mother very much.
She's not important to the story at all.
Yeah, Neelix is like her godfather or something. So
Naomi, I think, right?
Right, yeah. Naomi Wildman. So as far as the main cast members that have kids, who do you think is a good parent or a bad parent?
Well, the best ones are probably Dr. Crusher and Captain Sisko, I would think. Worf is still muddling through it and finally kind of gives up.
Worf is the worst, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Worf is the worst parent.
That seems right.
Well, I do think Loxana Troy.
Wow, she's pretty bad.
Yeah,
she's pretty bad. But Deanna Troy,
she's bad as a point. Oh, Loxana Troy is a bad parent. Yeah, I think Deanna would probably make a pretty good mother.
Deanna seems to be a good mother in Picard. She's in that one episode. They have a kid that they're seem to be.
We don't get. There's not a lot of information to go off there, but I could see her making a good mother. She does pretty well dealing with Alexander and that kind of stuff in TNG. I might kind of go with maybe an unpopular answer and say Nog or Rom as a good parent, because he allows his son to kind of go against the Ferengi way and join the Federation, and so he kind of is open about his future and lets him decide for himself and stuff. So
he's a very progressive Ferengi, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a very progressive. He's kind of a do a little bit, right? But
well, that's how he's presented.
But then he turns out he's really smart, right?
He's really smart,
very progressive, and I think that's I think it's a good example.
Yeah. I would have said between him and Captain Sisko, because he kind of does the same thing with Jake. He expects initially that Jake is going to become a Starfleet officer, just like him, follow in his footsteps. And then Jake, in the end, is like, no, I want to be a writer. I want to be an independent author.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? You're expecting him to, no, you're supposed to join Starfleet. Every kid of a Starfleet officer eventually joins Starfleet, right? Like that's a normal thing, and he kind of just lets him do that. And I think he's a pretty good dad as well. So
let's not leave out Gul Dukat.
He's the father. That's true.
He is a father. Actually, so I take it back. I said Worf was the worst parent. It's Gul Dukat.
Gul Dukat's probably the worst.
He's my favorite Deep Space Nine character.
I was going to ask you. You mentioned the characters of Star Trek that you had. You mentioned Tuvok, Gul Dukat, and a couple of some of them seemed obscure. They didn't seem like the normal crew members that you would expect. I would think. You said Kirk, and then I would think, okay, so he's got Spock and Bones and Scotty and Uhura too. But you said Kirk, Tuvok, Gul Dukat. Like characters that have nothing to do with each other. So I'm curious, what inspired the specific characters that you chose to make collector's items?
I do have these 7-inch figures of the main characters of the other series, but at first I didn't care much for Voyager, but then years later I saw it again and thought, this is really creative, unusual premises and so on. And I always liked Tuvok. I thought he did a great Spock, and I used to say that I think my wife suggested, why don't they just go back to the original time and have more episodes? And I said, yeah, I'd like to see them with what's the guy's name? Ray Liotta playing Pike, and Tim Russ playing Spock. So what if he's black? He does a great Nimoy Spock impression.
I always thought when I saw Tuvok initially, and I've seen Voyager, I've seen all of Voyager at some point, and Tuvok was one of my favorite characters as well. I did think he was underused for most of the last half of this. Whenever they got in 7 of 9, and then all of the shows became about either her or the Doctor, who I love. I love both of those characters, but Tuvok was very underutilized from that point on, in my opinion. But I thought that he was the most Vulcan that we've ever seen on Star Trek. Like, he was more Vulcan than Spock was a lot of times. Which, I mean, I guess that makes sense because Spock was half human, right?
Yeah. No. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, he was like totally, and I feel like we learned a lot about the Vulcan people through the original series and through Spock and the different movies that they made, but it was always a little bit obscure in the fact that he was half human. So you didn't know necessarily why Spock was acting the way he was. Is he acting this way because he's a Vulcan, or is he acting this way because he's a half Vulcan, half human, and he's struggling? And just how much emotion does he have? Is he fully emotionless? Is he just suppressing it because he's human? And a lot of these questions were kind of unresolved until Tuvok comes along and then gives you the rest of, this is what it means to be a Vulcan,
I loved one of my favorite Star Trek scenes is in The Next Generation, Unification, the second part, where Data is working alongside Spock. And he says, do you have any regrets? And he says, no, something. And he says, I have no regrets.
Do you have, I think he says, do you find that you've missed anything about your human life? And then,
and he says, I have no regrets. And he says, regrets, that's a human emotion, isn't it? And Spock pauses and says, fascinating. Oh,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And Data, speaking of Data, my favorite character in all of Star Trek through all of the series, I think, all of the different Star Trek shows, Data was always, I grew up primarily with The Next Generation. I mean, that was the time when I was a child and really introduced to Star Trek. I did watch the original series, but my perspective at that time watching it was, this looks kind of old. It looks kind of dated. It's not really, there's less of them. And I couldn't see it every week. It was just kind of like when it was on the reruns on Saturdays, if they showed it, And so this is obviously before streaming and DVD and all of that stuff, right? So, but yeah, so I knew of the original Star Trek and I did enjoy it, but The Next Generation was the era that I grew up in, and that was kind of how I got immersed into it. And Data, I thought, was just great. I wanted to be Data,
I'm totally with you. Data was my favorite as well. Him and Spock. Spock was a very early inspiration for me because I watched the original Trek before TNG even existed. So that was the only Trek that I had. And I really identified with Spock. And then Data came along and was kind of, even more.
He's like Spock 2.0 in a sense, but they went off in a different direction with it, almost the opposite direction, as Dr. Price was talking about in that episode. Data mentions that, he's telling Spock, you've abandoned. I think Spock comments to Data, you're fascinating. You are the ultimate achievement. There are Vulcans who aspire all their lives to achieve what you've been given by design, And then Data turns back at him and says, "You've rejected your human half," which means you've rejected what I've sought my entire life. You know, so they're kind of like the opposite, trying to achieve what the other one could have, but isn't really interested in.
Yeah, so brilliant,
so
such
great.
good writing.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I don't think that resonated with me as much at the time. I was very young when this show was on, but seeing it years later, I really understood, like that really connected it for me, because now I could see them truly as two distinct characters, you know, whereas when I was a kid, I viewed Data as just like a copy of Spock, but really he's not. He's like the opposite of Spock in a way.
Yeah, they're both emotionless, but then there's this different, that's
right.
I watched Star Trek when it first came on in the 60s, being an old fossil and all that. So I've watched each one as they came on, except for Discovery and so on. I've only recently started watching the animated series, and what a treasure that is. All the same. Boy, oh boy. But I've seen it evolve and devolve. I always thought Enterprise was very lame. And as some commentator eventually said, they picked the wrong guy as captain. It should have been the one that looked like George Bush, George W. Bush. What's his name? What was he, a Texan or something? Can't think of his name now.
I'm not sure.
A different actor to play Archer?
Well, that character should have been the captain of the Enterprise. Is more of a cowboy. And
are you talking the first officer, or not the first officer, but the other officer on that show?
Yeah, he was an engineer or something.
Tucker should have been the captain. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, right. And that would have been much better. And the plots I thought were lame. I could not accept that woman as a Vulcan. She didn't even have the right eyebrows and so on. And
let me ask you this, Dr. Price. How much of the show did you see? Like, at what point did you give up on it? Was it season 1?
I never did. I saw it to the end.
Oh, okay. Okay, interesting. So I get to disagree with you a little bit for the first time.
No,
I actually
I
actually liked Enterprise, but I do understand that reaction to it for the first couple seasons, because I watched it for the first couple seasons and I felt pretty much the same way. I felt like, I don't know what they're trying to do with this. The tone is weird. She doesn't really seem like a Vulcan to me. Captain Archer, I do like Scott Bakula, but I didn't know what the writers were doing with his. I didn't know how they were trying to make him distinctive at all in any way. He had a dog, but that was really the only thing that made him like stand out. So I do understand all those criticisms. I think by the time the show got to the 3rd season and then the 4th season, that's when I really started liking it, because I started seeing all of the different ways that they were tying in to the other Star Trek shows, and with the timeline, and trying to explain the way that why the Klingons look the way that they do, and why the Vulcans of that time changed, and why they're different. You know, their philosophy is different. They did eventually explain to Paul and why she's different. She seems less Vulcan.
What they said? What was I've forgotten that.
So there's a couple things with her. She has a couple of encounters with her mother, who ends up being a terrorist, but she's not really a terrorist. It's complicated, but she says, her mother says to her, you know, your emotions have always been closer to the surface. But then on top of that, there's an episode where she's like basically mind raped by another Vulcan that they find. I think it happened in an early season. But
that's pretty late. That's pretty late.
Was that late? Okay,
yeah,
I couldn't remember.
It's these renegade Vulcans who kind of have rejected the pure logical way, of the way the Vulcans are in the series, right? And they kind of more embrace emotion and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and so she was they mind melded with her in a way that wasn't. First of all, mind melds were rejected by Vulcan society at this time. And it was also done by an untrained person because it wasn't accepted in society. A lot of people didn't know how to do it properly. Anyway, he did something to her to where she was never able to basically fully control her emotions like a Vulcan should. And there's some kind of disease that the episode is supposed to be analogous to HIV, right? That's the social commentary that they're doing. She was raped and she got an STD, basically, and that's why she doesn't behave as Vulcan as she should, and that this is something that has to be corrected. It's in like one of the last, I think it's in the last season where the Vulcans, they meet. Who's the leader of the Vulcan society? The woman, T'Pau, I think. Yeah, and she knows about mind melds, and her people, her subculture of Vulcans, the true Vulcan way, the true followers of Surak, who embrace who are fully logical and suppress emotions and do believe in mind melds. So she's able to do a mind meld with her and sort of correct it, so she doesn't have the syndrome anymore. But they wait until like it's like in the last handful of episodes.
Yeah, where they resolve that, and so I get to disagree with both of you even, because I liked Enterprise from the very beginning, and it is my second favorite series after TNG. For me, it's TNG and then Enterprise. I love Scott Bakula as captain. I like the character. I liked Paul. I like Tucker. I love the Doctor. And it just kind of all around. I love the idea of them being the first Warp 5 ship, making the first we're making their first planet fall. We're the first ship that, the Federation, it's not even the Federation yet, but the first ship that Earth is sending out, and they're making all these kind of first discoveries. And I loved it from the get-go. I liked the third season where they were talking about the Expanse and all that, right? And it was
the Xindi.
And the Xindi and stuff. Like, well, how does that fit in? It's like, oh, don't worry, it'll all make sense in the end, and it does make sense in the end. And so I liked it from the very beginning, and I just thought it kept getting better and better, especially when you have the augments, right? And you have Brent Spinner playing Soon's like great grandfather, and not only do you explain what happens to the augments and that kind of stuff, and they tie it in, but they use that to explain why the Klingons in TOS look different than the Klingons in TNG, and it's a beautiful retcon that's super fun and right. They explain why the Vulcans are different, and they explain like there's a lot of Vulcan history that gets explained there. I thought was really good. The origin of the Federation and stuff comes out of that, and I really enjoyed it. I just think it is a really fun series. I've watched it multiple times.
Now, Discovery seems to have destroyed a lot of that explanations for why the Klingons look, because they look different in Discovery, and I don't understand that.
Yeah, I mean, really, the Klingons from Discovery just look like Klingons, but with shaved heads, right? Like if you grew their hair out, they would look like the Klingons from TNG, basically.
Maybe I need to watch it again. I've only watched 4 or 5 episodes of Discovery.
I mean, what we're supposed to assume is that you only see a certain kind of Klingon in TOS, and then we always see the other kind of Klingon. I guess in TNG by that time the genes kind of worked its way out, and so it's you don't see those kind of Klingons anymore. But you could easily retcon it and just say that that the Klingons that we see in Discovery just happen to be the ones that weren't affected by what happened in Enterprise, right? That's the thing that is one of the big problems with Discovery, is the technology seems to be more advanced than TNG, and so how do you make sense of all of that, right? But I am a lot more open to ignoring things like that, because I have to suspend my disbelief anyway to deal with transporters and right? And so if you want to tell a story in that era, but you don't want it to look silly by today's standards, you're going to have to do something kind of like that. And so I can it doesn't quite make sense given what the TOS Enterprise looked like, and Discovery is supposed to predate that. And
based on what they're doing with the production of Strange New Worlds, which is going to be the Captain Pike series, from the pictures I've seen of that, they are getting the balance right. Because the ship looks like the old Enterprise, but it doesn't look cheesy. The sets look better made, of better quality. The lighting is better. The clarity is better. The suits, the uniforms, they're obviously of the old design, but the quality looks much better. They updated it enough. So everything looks updated and advanced enough to where you can see it as being, this is what it should have. This is what the original Star Trek should have looked like if they could afford to make it look like that, right? But it doesn't look so advanced, like the technology is completely different.
Yeah, like season 2 of Discovery, you get a little glimpse of the bridge of the Enterprise, the original Enterprise, and it looks pretty good. It looks kind of like you're suggesting, where it's just a little more advanced, but it's got the basic. And I'm really looking forward to Strange New Worlds, because it could be really good. But you know, Discovery now has kind of solved that problem. I don't want any spoilers if you haven't seen it or whatever. But like, well, I guess Dr. Price is not going to watch it. Are you up on it, Bryce? Are you up on Discovery?
I am not up on it. I've only seen a couple of 4 or 5 episodes. You could, but here's the thing: my memory is so bad. You could tell me anything you want about it, and I will have forgotten by the time I get to the episode.
They sort of solve the problem because they send the Discovery far into the future.
I know that if it's spoiler about Captain Pike, I know that he's in an episode of that show, and he becomes aware of what's going to happen to him in the future, if that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily mean that. That is an element where he's kind of hinted at that kind of foreknowledge is whatever is hinted at, and I think he makes a choice, kind of knowing what it means.
I got a request in the comments for no spoilers. So
okay, I'm sorry.
Glass Monster. No spoilers, just to honor that. So in the last few minutes we have, I will ask both of you, starting with you, Dr. Price, favorite episode of Star Trek, and you can give me the title or you can describe it, and it can be of any Star Trek show.
Possibly Unification.
Okay. That's a 2-part episode, isn't it?
Yeah. The writing is so great. It's much better than it has to be. They don't let Spock's appearance carry the whole thing, though it is central. I just love it. Yeah.
You get a little taste of Sarek in that episode as well.
Yeah.
You learn more about the Romulan culture and why the Romulans and the Vulcans don't like each other, or why the Romulans don't like the Vulcans anyway. That was a great episode when I saw it, because it wasn't the first time we got an original series crew member on on Picard's Enterprise, but I feel like it was the first one that was a 2-parter where the episode revolved around it, because I think Scotty was in an episode as well.
Yeah, I love that one too, but this was just superior even.
Yeah. How about you, Dr. Johnson?
So I have 4 things I want to say to close out. One is Dr. Price would enjoy the Star Wars Minute podcast, because there's a podcaster on there that thinks that everything besides the 1977 Star Wars is not canon. He thinks 77 is it, and everything else is bunk. Empire, everything. Secondly, if you saw me scrolling on my phone a while ago, I was paying attention. I was trying to find a picture I was going to show you, but I never did find it. It was of a mobile I made for my son, where the top layer was all the original Star Trek crew. The middle layer was the Star Wars crew, and the bottom layer was the current Doctor Who and his companions at the time, and it was layered. This is actually the Enterprise that went with the crew of that mobile there. That's what I was trying to find a picture of, but I couldn't find it. Sorry. My favorite episodes, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to say 2, because there's 2 things I like about Star Trek. It's its social commentary and the sci-fi element, right? So for social commentary, I know we've already mentioned this episode, but it's Who Watches the Watchers, the episode about the Mintakans, where they discover that, and because it has such a direct religion is dangerous. It can be, like Picard has this huge speech about these people have already got rid of their superstition and their religion, and you're asking me to interject that back in? No, I will not do that. That is the worst of all crimes. I am willing to die in order.
And his acting in that scene is great. This is classic Patrick Stewart acting. Right.
Yeah, but he's willing to die to make sure that religion does not make that resurgence, right? And so that socially, I think that's the best. Sci-fi wise, go ahead.
He becomes a Christ figure. He's willing to be executed to save these people.
Yeah, that didn't even occur to me. That's ironic,
right? To undo a religion rather than to establish one, right? Yeah. But sci-fi wise, for just pure sci-fi grit fun, it's Parallels, which is the season 7, episode 5, I think, episode where Worf is jumping between.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
realities. And I'm going to give a little plug here. So in my sci-fi course, that I did for the great courses. It is video. If you want, you can also listen to it as an audiobook and that kind of stuff. But it is video. And one of the topics that I talk about in there is the idea that there are multiple universes. Are there reasons for thinking there actually are multiple universes, et cetera, right? And that's the episode I use of Star Trek TNG. I use that episode of TNG to talk about that idea of multiple universes. And we pulled a little gag that you can't see on the audiobook. But where what we did is we had a set that we used for the entire the entire 24 lecture series, right? And we shot all of the episodes except for that episode on parallels and parallel universes, right? So we did the whole thing. I had a full beard the entire time. I wore a vest. I had a certain way that I dressed and everything. Then after we were done with everything except for that episode, we completely changed the set. I shaved the beard down to a goatee. I dressed completely differently. The color was different. Everything was different. And then we just did the lecture like normal, right? But without actually without mentioning the fact that essentially I'm from a parallel universe here. And I'm presenting the lecture in that way, right? And it was this wonderful little kind of like sight gag that we did that you can't see on the audiobook. But we did it for that. We were talking about parallel universes that episode. It was such a fun course. It was
the telltale sign of being from a parallel universe is having a goatee, right?
Having the goatee, or losing the goatee, right? And so that's why I did reverse, right? You want Spock to be evil Spock, you just whip a goatee on him, right? You want Dr. Johnson to be evil Dr. Johnson, you shave his beard down to a goatee.
Gotcha. Do me a favor, because we are going to wrap up. I do have one more question to ask, but I want to remind you guys, both of you, before we wrap up, stick around after the show. Stick around in the stream after the show, because I want to talk to both of you out of sight, out of mind. Sure. But the final question is, I asked you about episodes, and I guess I should mention mine. Mine is the best of both worlds. But that's just,
Yeah, that's a tough choice, because that's a great one.
That's the first cliffhanger episode of any TV show I ever saw as a kid, where it was truly you had no idea what was going to happen until you had to wait a whole nother year to find out what is going to happen. Does Picard live? Does he die? So that was my favorite episode of all the Star Trek shows. Favorite movie?
I was gonna say, just to add in, the way they resolved that cliffhanger is very Doctor Who-ish. Right, because with Doctor Who, you would always have this big cliffhanger every 20 minutes on the old shows, and then they would come back and resolve it, but just run that way, right? Whatever
Batman
the big problem
was.
Right.
Every episode of Batman
would just immediately be revealed. It's oh no, it's not really a problem, right? So we have the big blazer that we're going to shoot at the Borg, and it just does nothing, right? But anyway, go ahead. Favorite movie.
Favorite Star Trek movie. You can start.
I'm looking at my collection here. TNG or TOS?
Any of them. You can do either. You can do both. It could be one of the new ones.
Oh man, I want to say First Contact. First Contact is so good. Where the Borg are involved and all that, and right,
it's the sequel to Best of Both Worlds.
Yeah, it really is. It is so good. But this may not be the most popular. I'm tempted to say 4. 4 is one of the earliest ones I saw, and I absolutely loved time travel episodes. And oh man, I had fun with that whenever I was young and saw that, and they were in modern day and all that kind of stuff. And like we talked before, the episode where McCoy gives the guy, you got kidney dialysis, here, take 2 of these, you'll be better in 5 minutes. Right? It's just so much fun. It's good stuff. So one of those.
Yeah, Dr. Price.
I guess mine would be The Wrath of Khan. I mean, there's loads of great stuff in all of them, but that one I think is my favorite.
It's a very good choice.
I agree with you. I think Wrath of Khan is my favorite. First Contact is probably my second favorite, though.
It's great.
Yeah. You know what? I really want to thank you guys for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun. Kate didn't get a chance to come back with us, but I am sure that he had fun as well. He's a little bit less of a Star Trek nerd and probably had to digest what we were talking about as it was happening. But yeah, it was great having you guys both on. We would love to invite you both back. anytime you want, really, to have guests of your caliber. So I would like to also thank everybody who participated in the comments. The book, The Orville, Dr. Johnson, is that available on Amazon?
Oh yeah, Exploring the Orville. It's available on Amazon. Exploring the Orville. Essays on Seth MacFarlane's space adventure, and a little bit of plug here. If you turn it around the back, Seth MacFarlane wrote a blurb for the book. Like, he saw an advanced copy or what, and you can read it yourself or whatever. But like, he was very impressed with it. He really liked it. I'll let you look up the blurb if you're interested. You can find it pretty easy online if you look up the book. Like, I was very, very, very proud. Andre Bormanis, who worked on the Orville and also worked on Star Trek, he wrote the foreword for the book. And there's some great chapters. I was very, very proud of the authors and stuff. So yeah, that's available. For other fans, another book that I have out recently, if I'm plugging stuff, is my Black Mirror and Philosophy book. That is another edited collection of mine. It has a chapter dedicated to every episode
of Black Mirror.
Each episode gets its own chapter, and then there's 6 chapters at the end that kind of deal with the series as a whole. And the goal, essentially, of each chapter is try to identify what kind of point or what kind of argument the episode is making, and then try to examine whether that point or that argument or whatever holds up, right? So questions like should you bring your deceased loved one back from the dead? What is the purpose of criminal punishment in relating to White Bear? Is
it ethical for you to live out your fantasies, your Star Trek fantasies involving other people against their will?
Yes, there's a whole chapter on how we should behave in video games dedicated that is inspired by the USS Callister episode, right? Shut Up and Dance is about vigilante justice. The Black Museum is about vengeance. The Hang the DJ chapter is about digital dating. It literally is just like, is it right to do dating services? Like, is it ethical? Are there concerns about doing digital dating and dating sites and that kind of stuff? There's a whole is it ethical to fuck a pig? Sorry for the from the first episode, right?
Oh boy, yeah.
How do we deal with the ethics of if somebody's life is on the line, but you have to perform an immoral action? Is it ethical to do all of that stuff is dealt with throughout I'm very, very happy with it. Last little plug about it. Bandersnatch, the Choose Your Own Adventure episode that's on Netflix of Black Mirror, where you can actually select for the character to make certain decisions. And the chapter or the episode plays out and can play out in 5 different ways. And there's multiple ways to get to those 5 different endings. Chris Lay and I wrote a Choose Your Own Adventure chapter for that episode, where you have an introduction, and then there's which question are you more interested in, 1 or 2? If you're interested in 1, go to this page. If you're interested in 2, go to that page. You go to the next section. Questions are presented at the end, and it has 5 different endings for the chapter.
That's really clever.
It was a lot of fun. It was challenging. It was really challenging to do, diagramming it all out and that kind of stuff. But we kind of teamed up and did it, and it's
awesome.
It's good stuff.
These books are definitely going on my Amazon wish list, and if you're interested, check them out. And
cool.
Dr. Price, what can we expect from you upcoming as far as future appearances, or what have you got going on? Because you have a huge fan base, everyone here at PSF, and of course over on Tang, my other network, the Atheist Network Group as well, wants to know what Dr. Price is up to.
Well, I'm going to be on Myth Vision a bunch, and I'm probably tomorrow going to do a new Bible Geek. And let's see, I have in a few days, actually, my book Judaizing Jesus is due out. And shortly thereafter, I think, wait a minute, it may be January when I think Merely Christianity is out, and probably the same for a third book, When Gospels Collide. And I have a couple of horror anthologies in the works, and the Yog Sothoth cycle, the Yig cycle, and new issues of Eldritch Tales and Crypt of Cthulhu. and just got a new issue of the Journal of Higher Criticism out, and another one will probably come out pretty soon. So
a lot of stuff then. And you are an H.P. Lovecraft fan, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Okay. What did you think of Lovecraft Country?
I didn't see it.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I just don't have time. There's so many things that look kind of interesting that I just can't spare the time.
You're writing too much and you're making too many appearances to get invested in a new show, you know. So I totally get it. Well, we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us about Star Trek. This was really fun. I hope you guys come back. I'd like the two of you to hang out backstage after credits. But for everyone else, if you are interested in continuing the conversation, you can join us on Discord. The link will be in the chat. And yeah, I had a really great time. I hope you guys did too. And this is Secular Soapbox. We are on Wednesdays, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Promethean Secular Frontier, and also find us on Facebook. So with that, for K-Lub, producer Wes, Kat the Humanist, and Josh the Archon, I am Brycearonee for Team Promethean. We will see you in the future.